Studying the book of James. This evening we want to pick up with verse 19 through, Lord willing, through the end of the chapter, verse 27. Here he begins to make application. The things that he said, whenever you're making a statement and you're putting some things out there, there is an inference, there's an application, there's implications of these things. If this being true, then this also is true. And so he begins here with verse 19. It begins with the word wherefore. Now, wherefore is kind of like the word therefore. And every time I see that, I remember and think of and have to repeat what the teacher, when I was in Bible college, pointed out. Whenever you see the word therefore, look and see what it's there for. In other words, it's connecting the things that have preceded it to that which comes after it. It's if this is so, then this is so, or this is the application so. And so here we see the application. Wherefore, my beloved brethren. So James begins to make a practical application of the spiritual principles he has laid out for us, which is, he was talking about the trying, the testing of our faith and of our character, and also it talks about temptation to sin. And so he points out that when we're tempted and so on, God may use this to test our character, to prove us, but let us also understand that when we are tempted to sin, we're not tempted of God. God cannot be tempted with sin, and neither does He tempt us with sin. But He said when we're tempted, we're drawn away of our own lust and enticed, and it goes on. And so He's pointed these things out, and how that every good gift and every perfect gift, that comes from God. Temptation to sin doesn't come from God, but every good gift does. And so he says, wherefore? He said, let every man, and I believe here the idea is that each individual, each person, he's talking not just to the men, but to men, women, boys and girls, everybody who professes to be saved. Like, wherefore, my beloved brethren, the brothers and sisters in Christ, those that are saved. And so each person who professes to be saved, he's saying this applies to you. Be swift to hear, slow to speak, slow to wrath. And I want us to notice some things here in this statement in verse 19. It said, let every man be swift to hear, slow to speak, slow to wrath. Hearing is passive. It's the idea of receiving. Whereas speaking, that's something that's active, and that's something that's proceeding out from us. Hearing is what's coming in to us of what we're receiving. Speaking is what's going out. And so he's saying we need to be swift to hear. Be ready to hear. He said, but slow to speak and slow to wrath or anger. The idea of the speaking, and especially we see wrath or anger, it's active, it's a reaction, it's a retaliation. And remember, this is in context. See, a lot of times, this is one of the things I've noticed, even myself. I'm so familiar with different verses of Scripture. And we take these verses and we preach on them, we teach on them. But boy, when you go back and you're going through the whole book, when you're getting the whole context, when you're getting the chain of thoughts here that he's laying out, and then you read these verses in that context, it opens up a whole different picture for us. And so the context, if we go back and we think about this, when we're undergoing trials, when we're going through temptations, and we're being enticed, and we have all these things going on around us, we have a tendency to react. And he's talked about some of these different characteristics and things, and we'll get to that. But in other words, we need to wait on the Lord, exercise spiritual discernment, examine the circumstances. Verse 12 we read, "Blessed is the man that endureth temptation." And see, that was the kind of the leading in here. He's talking about these things, but blessed is the man that endureth temptations. And that includes the temptation to lose your anger, lose your temper. Doesn't it? When persons or circumstances produce trials and temptations to sin, we tend to react in anger, to say things in anger and do things in anger. This is our natural reaction to anything that we feel threatens us. And isn't that what? Trials, tribulations, circumstances, they threaten our person, they threaten our security, they threaten our comfort zone. And when we feel threatened, we tend to retaliate. And so that's be slow, be swift to hear, but slow to speak, slow to wrath, or slow to anger. I was reminded, when I was a child, how many of you, as children, perhaps us as parents, have said the same thing to our children? When you start to get angry, well, they say, count to 10. How many of you heard that? When you get angry, count to 10 before you do anything, before you say anything. Well, that's kind of what James is saying here, but so much more. Counting to 10, that gives a person time to cool down. Because when something happens, and we feel threatened, anger or fear, adrenaline, our bodies respond. There's a physical response that involves the production of adrenaline, which is shot into our blood system and everything, and that spikes. And if you react, because it's that fight or flight, they call it, syndrome. That the adrenaline spikes, it's to give you that extra energy and everything and strength to either stand and fight or to run away and flee. And counting to 10 gives you time to kind of cool down. And remember the context here, that not just to be, but to be swift to hear. We'll come to that. Now, counting to 10 gives that person time to cool down, that initial burst of adrenaline that spikes when something triggers an anger response. But this is what lost people do. Since they're carnal and not able to apply spiritual principles and truths. See, this is kind of the best that the lost people can do. Now, there's some truth to it, and that helps. But James is taking this and applying this to us as believers, as Christians. There's more to this than just counting to 10. He says, the first thing he said, be swift to hear. Be ready to receive instruction. As a child of God, we're to do more than just count to 10. We're to seek in prayer the wisdom and grace of God to strengthen us and lead us in the correct response. Remember what James already talked about here, and the 4 characteristics we need to develop and to exercise in order to endure temptations: patience, wisdom. He said, if any of you lack wisdom, let him ask of God. But here it's in a particular context. is when somebody says something or does something, we're in a circumstance, we're going through trials and temptations, and we feel threatened and fearful. What's the right thing to do? What are we supposed to do? There's wisdom. Wisdom to know how to deal with that. God will give it to you. But you have to be willing to listen. You know, steadfastness. Be willing to stand and to do what God tells you to do. Do that which is right. No matter what, you know. Sometimes when we get afraid, we're tempted to lie. You know, we may be tempted to do things that we've been told, well, that's wrong. You shouldn't do that. But in the moment of the circumstance, we might be tempted to do something. But the steadfastness to do that which is right, and humility. These four things. So when someone or something, some circumstance has triggered an anger response or a fear response, and the adrenaline spikes, we need to be swift to hear, to receive instruction, rebuke, reproof, correction. Notice what Paul says in 2 Timothy, because I believe this ties in to what James is talking about here. 2 Timothy chapter 3 and verse 16 says, all Scripture is given by the inspiration of God and is profitable for doctrine, for reproof, for correction, for instruction in righteousness. And so he goes on, chapter 4 says, preach the word, be instant in season, out of season, reprove, rebuke, exhort with all long suffering and doctrine. And so sometimes when we find ourselves in these situations, we need to hear. And so that's some of the things he talked about here. In verse 19, he said, be swift to hear. Verse 21, he says, to receive with meekness the engrafted word. Be willing to hear. Hear what God is saying through His Word. And how is it that He speaks to us? Well, He may be speaking to us as we're reading the Bible and we're studying the Bibles ourselves, our own personal study time, and we're praying about things. You know, something's happening. Instead of just reacting to it, maybe you need to go off, pray about it, take the Bible and start studying the Bible. Read the Bible. This is how God speaks to us. But also through the preaching and teaching of God's Word. We may be going through something in God. You know, He'll lay it on the heart of the preacher, the Sunday school teacher, whoever, to be teaching on that. And it's just what we need to hear. And I know that's happened to me. As a teenager, and I was in Sunday school class. And I was going through some things. And the Sunday school teacher got off subject, was talking about something, and it was exactly what I needed to hear to encourage me and teach me. And then he kind of stopped and looked kind of puzzled, said, I don't know why I got off onto that. And he got back on track and teach Sunday school class. And I'm sitting back there in the back room just smiling to myself because I knew exactly why he got off track. It was what I needed to hear. And how many times, you know, he's done that. And it may not always be to encourage, but sometimes there may be sin in our life. And remember, God uses these to talk about the trying of your faith. Now, He's not sending the temptation. He's not trying to get us to sin. But He may use that as an opportunity to show us a weakness, to show us where we need to change. Maybe we have an attitude problem. We have some kind of problem in our life. And so, it's to reveal these things to us. It goes on, if we react to people and circumstances in wrath or anger, this is not going to glorify God or work the righteousness of God. He says here in verse 20, for the wrath of man worketh not the righteousness of God. We get angry. Whatever we say or do is not going to be the right thing. It's not going to glorify God. Now he talks about, let our light so shine that men see our good works and they glorify your Father which is in heaven. We get angry and we lose our temper. We begin to retaliate. We say things. We do things. That's not going to work the righteousness of God. Verse 21, again, wherefore? So he comes back, and so he's continuing to apply what he's talked about the trying of our faith, about these characteristics that we need, that we might be able to endure temptations, and so on. And so he says here again then, in verse 19 said, wherefore, my beloved brethren, let every man be swift to hear, slow to speak, slow to wrath. For the wrath of man worketh not the righteousness of God. Now verse 21, he says again, wherefore? Now he's still speaking to the same group of people. He's still speaking to us as believers. And so we see another practical application beginning here. He says, lay apart. That is to put away from you. All filthiness and superfluity of naughtiness, and receive with meekness the engrafted word which is able to save your souls. And so he said there's two things that we need to be doing and need to be examining this, and the context is trials and tribulations. And one of the things that we see that he points out, the trying of your faith is more precious than gold tried by fire. It's the idea of refining. Our trials and temptations may be used of God as fire is used to refine gold and silver, to purify and sanctify us. And so, when we become angry, we need to examine ourselves first, instead of blaming or becoming angry with others. Focusing and directing that anger at people, things, or circumstances, and sometimes at God. God, why don't you let this happen to me? That's the way people react. Well, see, they're being swift there to anger. They're swift to speak rather than being slow to those things and being swift to hear. Instead of looking at it, okay, Lord, I'm getting angry here. I know I shouldn't. What's wrong? What are you trying to teach me? What would you have me to do? There may be sins or imperfections. Well, there's no maybe about it. As long as we're in this flesh, he says there's no good thing dwelleth in this flesh. And our sanctification is an ongoing process. We're constantly being refined. And you take something like gold and silver, when it's originally mined out of the earth, it's full of dirt and rock and all kinds of impurities. It's not pure gold, or very seldom. But a lot, and that's the reason it has to be smelted. It has to be refined. And it takes a lot of heat to refine it. And that's what God compares our trials to in this life, is we are to be conformed or made over into the image of His Son. And we know that Jesus Christ is set before us as an example. And we know we ought to be like Him. But if we're just left to ourselves, we'll just kind of go on our merry way, the way we've always done. And so God allows trials. He allows these things to come upon us in order to refine us. And yes, it's hard at the time. But when we find ourselves in those situations, we need to realize there may be some fault in our character the Lord would purge out. And that's the reason there's these references to lay apart, to put away from you certain things. Now, the Scriptures, a lot of lists in the Scriptures, and I just want to touch on a couple of them. Galatians 5, and verses 19 through 21 talks about the works of the flesh. He says, now the works of the flesh are manifest, which are these: adultery, fornication, uncleanness, lasciviousness, idolatry, witchcraft, hatred, variance, emulations, wrath. One of the things that he mentioned there, isn't it? Wrath, that's right in the middle strife, seditions, heresies, envyings, murders, drunkenness, revelings, and such like. You know, there's a few things you look at there in that list. Well, I don't commit idolatry. I don't practice witchcraft. I'm not a murderer. What does the Scripture say? If you're angry with someone, if you hate someone without a cause, you have committed murder in your heart. How many times have we just gotten angry with someone? We're guilty. Talk about stubbornness and rebellion. That's the same as idolatry and witchcraft. If you've been stubborn, you've been rebellious, you're guilty of idolatry and witchcraft. Those attitudes is what's at the heart of those sins. And so as he talked about these things, obviously these things, he says, I tell you before, and such like of the which I tell you before, as I have also told you in time past, that they which do such things shall not inherit the kingdom of God. And then he goes on to describe the fruit of the Spirit, those things that we are to put on. In Ephesians chapter 4, we have another list here, actually two sets of lists that are kind of mixed together. Talks about putting off the old man and putting on the new man. In Ephesians chapter 4, verse 20, he said, but you've not so learned Christ, if so be that you have heard him. Notice that you've heard him. What is it? Be swift to hear. That'll be the first thing that we do, is to open our ears and say, God, what are you saying to me? What would you have me to know? So if you have heard him and have been taught by him as the truth is in Jesus, that you put off concerning the former conversation, the old man. Now right there, just kind of hold your place. You put off the former conversation, the old man, which is corrupt according to the deceitful lust, and be renewed in the spirit of your mind. Chapter 2, Ephesians chapter 2, verse 1 said, you hath he quickened who were dead in trespasses and sins, wherein in times past ye walked according to the course of this world, according to the prince of the power of the air, the spirit that now worketh in the children of disobedience, among whom also we all had our conversation in times past in the lusts of our flesh, fulfilling the desires of the flesh and of the mind, and were by nature the children of wrath, even as others. It goes on, but God, by the grace of God, and so on. And so he's referring back to that here. He said, who being past, lost my place. Ephesians chapter 20, or verse 20. There we go. That you put off, verse 22, concerning the former conversation, the old man. Verse 24 then, and that you put on the new man, which after God has created in righteousness and true holiness. Well, he said the wrath of man does not work the righteousness of God. Put on the new man, which after God has created in righteousness and true holiness. Wherefore, putting away lying, speak every man truth with his neighbor, for we are members one of another. Be ye angry and sin not. Let not the sun go down upon your wrath. Neither give place to the devil. Let him that stole steal no more, but rather let him labor, working with his hands the thing which is good, that he may have to give to him that needeth. Let no corrupt communication proceed out of your mouth, but that which is good to the use of edifying, that may minister grace unto the hearers. And he goes on, so we have this list here, to put off and at the same time to put on. And I believe that's what James is talking about here. And that we be swift to hear, but slow to speak and slow to wrath. Especially to speak, in the instance of our anger and temper when we are undergoing a trial or something of this nature. And we see that these things are our responsibility. And we also see from Paul's letter to the Ephesians that we're to put on the new man, which James refers to here when he says, "Be swift to hear, and receive with meekness the engrafted word." And in verse 22, he says, "But," now, because this is in laying aside, lay apart all filthiness and superfluity, he said, but in contrast to that, "But be ye doers of the word, and not hearers only, deceiving your own selves." So here he's admonished to be doers of the word, and not hearers only. We're to hear and receive the word, the instruction, correction, reproof, rebuke, etc., the encouragements, exhortations, the things that God would say to us. But then we're to put it into practice. We're to do it. And see, that's what James is exhorting and encouraging us here, to put into practice. Here's the practical application for these spiritual truths. We talk about the trials of your faith and these things, but now the practical application of that spiritual truth. So we need to do. We need to do some things here. And in Matthew 28, when the commission is given, and he says, "Teach them to observe." That observe is not just sitting back and watching. That is to put it into practice, to do it. You know, when we observe the Lord's Supper, we are participating in it. We're partaking of it. We're doing something. We're not just sitting there watching. If you're a member of the church, if you're not a member, you sit there and watch. But we as members, we are putting into practice. We're doing that which He's told us to do, and so on. And so he says we're to put it into practice. We're to do. Verses 23 through 25. Here, James rebukes those who hear the word or read or study the word, become aware of what it says, but then fail to put into practice what they've so learned. You know, that's what he's talking about here. He said, "Not hearers only, deceiving your own self." He said, "For if any be a hearer of the word and not a doer, he is like unto a man beholding his natural face in a glass. For he beholdeth himself and goeth his way, and straightway forgetteth what manner of man he was." In other words, the Word of God, like a mirror, shows you your face. You see if your hair is combed properly. You see, if there's a smudge of dirt or something on your face. And if there's dirt there, you get a washcloth and you clean it off. If your hair is not parted right, then you get the comb, you comb it, do whatever. The mirror reflects that. This is the true image. And it reflects our imperfections as well as how good looking we are. And so, you know, well, in a spiritual sense, if we're in the image and likeness of Christ, we're good looking. But because we're in the flesh, we still have sin. There's that smudge, there's that dirt, there's, that grease spot or whatever that we see. And we need to wipe it off. And he's saying somebody that hears the Word of God, that has read these things and knows what it says, and then doesn't do anything, just goes on the way he has been. It's like somebody looks in the mirror and says, "Man, my hair is a mess, and I got mud and stuff all over my face," and then just goes out in public like that. He said, that's what it's like. You know, we wouldn't do that. Literally, but we do spiritually. James then goes on to praise and point out that the man who becomes a doer of the word shall be blessed in his deed. His deed referring to those things done in obedience to the word. 1 Corinthians 15:58, he says, "We know that our labor is not in vain in the Lord." When we do those things that God would have us to do, we know that's not in vain. You know, those things that we do in the flesh, that's vain. And he goes on here in verses 26 and 27. He says, if any man among you seem to be religious, and bridleth not his tongue, but deceiveth his own heart, this man's religion is vain. And bridleth not his own tongue. Let's put that in context. Well, we've been swift to hear, slow to speak. But in the context, we see that it is speaking in anger, retaliation. You know, it's just natural. Somebody says something and it hurts your feelings. It makes you angry. The first thing your impulse to do is to say something back at them, to retaliate in kind. And that's exactly what James is talking about here. You know, we need to bridle. If you think you're religious, but you have no control over your anger, and over your passions, you hear the Word of God, and it shows you your imperfections. It shows you where you need to change, where you need to clean up your life, and you ignore it and you go on. He says that religion is vain. It's empty. It's worthless. Now, Paul said there in Corinthians, we just read that, said your labor is not in vain in the Lord. But that which we do in the flesh is vain. And if we have a fleshly religion, a religion that doesn't change us in the flesh, he said that religion is vain. James draws this to a conclusion at this point. But he'll have more to say about the tongue in chapter 3. And when he talks about bridling the tongue here, this would appear to be a reference back to verse 19, you know, where he says, slow to speak. You know, rein that tongue in, hold that tongue back. Which taken together in context would seem to refer to our response when facing persecution, trial, or when men say all manner of evil against us falsely, etc. Matthew chapter 5. See, James here is pointing us back to the original teachings of Jesus Christ. In Matthew chapter 5, the Sermon on the Mount. And there's 3 different places, just in chapter 5, in the Sermon on the Mount, the Beatitudes and other statements we want to look at here. Verse 10, blessed are they. And what did he say? Blessed is the man that endureth temptation. So here we come back to the idea of being blessed. Blessed are they which are persecuted for righteousness' sake, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are ye, when men shall revile you and persecute you, and shall say all manner of evil against you falsely for my sake. Rejoice and be exceeding glad, for great is your reward in heaven. For so persecuted they the prophets which were before you. Blessed is the man that endureth persecution. See, that endureth temptation. You have to be blessed, you have to be able to endure it. And that's where he goes back. That's what he was talking about in the first part of that, and those characteristics. Notice verse 21, 22. It said, you've heard that it has been said of them of old time, thou shalt not kill. And whoever shall kill shall be in danger of the judgment. But I say unto you, that whosoever is angry with his brother without a cause shall be in danger of the judgment. And so here he goes back and he underlines that anger without cause. Now there are some things, you know, the Lord gets angry with, and we give him cause to be angry. But hey, if somebody just says something that hurts your feelings, that's not cause to be angry with them in your heart. We're to love our enemies. We're to bless them, and so on. Verse 38. You've heard that it has been said, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. In other words, well, he said something back to me, I'm going to retaliate. See, the Bible gives me the permission to retaliate. No, it doesn't. That was not the purpose for which God intended that. And he goes on to point out, vengeance is mine, I will repay. That was a statute that was established for the judges for justice, that the punishment should be equal to and fitting to the offense. It was establishing a standard of righteous judgment, a just judgment. But he goes on to say that vengeance is mine. It's not yours to take it upon yourself to execute vengeance, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. And he goes on here to say, to make the application, but I say unto you, that ye resist not evil. That is, don't retaliate. But whosoever shall smite thee on thy right cheek, turn to him the other also. And if any man shall sue thee at the law, and take away thy coat, let him have thy cloak also. And whosoever shall compel thee to go a mile, go with him twain or two. Give to him that asketh thee, and from him that would borrow of thee, turn not thou away. And goes on. Talking about thou shalt love thy neighbor. And hate, said, you have heard that it hath been said, thou shalt love thy neighbor and hate thine enemy. But I say unto you, love your enemies. Bless them that curse you. Do good to them that hate you. And pray for them that which despitefully use you and persecute you. So when something happens and there's that spike of adrenaline, there's that rush of anger, he says, rein it in. Remember what Jesus said. Put it into practice what Jesus told you to do. Pray for them which despitefully use you and persecute you, that you may be the children of your Father which is in heaven. For he maketh his sun to rise on the evil and the good, and sendeth rain on the just and the unjust. For if you love them which love you, what reward have you? Do not even the publicans the same? And if ye salute your brethren only, what do ye more than others? Do not even the publicans so? Be ye therefore perfect, even as your Father which is in heaven is perfect. And so, notice over in Romans 12. Romans 12 verses 17. It said, recompense no man evil for evil. Provide things honest in the sight of all men. If it be possible, as much as lieth in you, live peaceably with all men. Dearly beloved, avenge not yourself, but rather give place unto wrath. For it is written, vengeance is mine, I will repay, saith the Lord. Therefore, if thine enemy hunger, feed him. If he thirst, give him drink. For in so doing thou shalt heap coals of fire on his head. Be not overcome of evil, but overcome evil with good. And so we see in the Scriptures these different things that is pointing us, and this is the same thing that James is pointing out to us here, that in these times of trials and tribulations and temptations that come upon us, temptations to do evil and temptations to sin, but being angry and speaking out in anger and hatred towards someone, even an enemy who persecutes you and says all manner of evil against you falsely for his sake, we're not to retaliate. We're not to resist the evil. But we're to manifest the love of God in a practical way, praying for them, feeding, giving them drink. 1 Peter 3 verse 8. Finally, be ye all of one mind, having compassion one of another. Love as brethren. Be pitiful, be courteous. Not rendering evil for evil, or railing for railing, but contrariwise, blessing, knowing that ye are thereunto called, that you should inherit a blessing. And so, We could read on. You get the gist of what he's saying here. Blessed is the man that endureth temptation. Our natural tendency to get angry and revile back, to retaliate in kind, especially with our words. He said, this man's religion is vain. The individual who has no control over his anger, does not want to control his anger, and seeks to rationalize and justify his anger. You know, some people, they get angry and everything. Well, now the Bible says, the Lord teaches us, we're not, but so-and-so, they did this to me, and I have a right to, you know. Not only are they being disobedient, they're being rebellious, they're being stubborn, and they're trying to justify and rationalize their behavior. This is what James said, this man's religion is vain. James is pointing out how to discern the phony professor of religion from the genuine possessor of Christ and God's grace. This is the same thing other inspired writers of the Word of God have done as well. We need to take heed to these warnings. You know, the Gospel of John and Epistles of John and different ones that hear about, we know. You know, between the spirit of evil and that which is good, between that which is an error and that which is truth, and so on. You know, from these things we can discern those that are saved and those that are not, those whose religion is vain, and those that is not. Pure religion is to do good. So James brings this back to, and he talks about some of those things, the practical things. Again, James is all about practicality, how we show we love people, we're concerned about people by the things we do. And that's where he says, pure religion undefiled before God and the Father is this, to visit the fatherless and widows in their affliction. You know, those that are in need. So we come alongside and we help them. And I think that's an example. That doesn't limit us to just that, because we see in the Scripture other things, that your enemies, that those that persecute you, if you're hungry, feed them. If they're thirsty, give them drink. You know, people in their affliction, whatever their needs may be, regardless of how we've been treated, the golden rule, do unto others as you would have others do unto you. Treat them the way you want to be treated. Not the way necessarily they have treated you, or you may anticipate that they may treat you. You know, how many times you talk to people and they let things slip, and they talk about, you know, people and what they think that these people may do. I haven't done it yet, but, well, they will. You know, they're going to. Well, even if you think that, you treat them the way you want to be treated. Pure religion, undefiled. Visit the fatherless and the widows in their affliction. These, that is, the orphans and widows, those who had no source of income, no support, those, you know, those are the ones that, the defenseless, those that are in need and can't help themselves. Then we should be concerned, and keep himself unspotted from the world. These two things, do good and refrain from evil. Part of the world, the attitude of the world, somebody does something, get angry. You know, express that anger. And it seems, and this is the thing you get into the world is constantly contradicting itself. On the one hand, we're teaching children it's okay to express those feelings. But then when they grow up and they express those feelings, we make them take anger management classes. We just set them up for failure. But isn't that true? They teach them in school, it's okay, Johnny, you just express how you feel about it. Get it out there. So he goes all through school being told that's okay to express yourself. Then he gets a job or something and he's out in public and he expresses how he feels, really feels about somebody or something, and they make him take anger management classes. They should have been teaching that instead of this other stuff to begin with. To do good. And the point was that being unspotted from the world, that's part of the world philosophy. It's okay to be angry. It's okay to have those feelings. Those feelings are natural. Yeah, it's part of the natural man. It is natural. But it's part of that nature we're responsible to control. See, that's the part they don't understand. We're that way, it's natural because of sin and because of the fall and because of our depraved nature. And that's what Jesus Christ came to die for and to save us from the consequences of that sin and that fall. And not only to teach us, but to enable us to be able to lay aside those things and do what is right instead. That's what pure religion before God is. Doing what's right and refraining from that which is wrong. Let us stand then at this time.